You think you know evil until you see it dressed in fatherhood. A man with no criminal record. A man with a promising military career. A husband. A father. One summer day in 1994, he waited until his children were asleep. And then, he picked up a crowbar, a machete, and a rope. He killed not one, not two, but his entire family. Sylvia, his wife, Edward III, his little boy, and Anna, just 5 years old. And when he was done, he cleaned a house, packed a suitcase, and disappeared like nothing ever happened. But now, after 31 years of appeals, silence, and slow justice, the state of Florida has executed Edward Zakrzewski. This is True Crime Briefing. And this is the true story, served you chilled and with facts.
One crime, 1,000 questions. Welcome to True Crime Briefing, where the truth is never buried for long.
Edward James Zakrzewski wasn't someone you'd immediately peg as dangerous. On paper, he seemed like the embodiment of structure and service. Born in Michigan in 1965, he was raised in a working-class household where discipline and obedience were instilled early. His father, a quiet man with a rigid worldview, valued control. His mother, reserved and emotionally distant, was often described as cold but dutiful. Edward grew up knowing the value of order, but very little about warmth or empathy. At 18, with few prospects and a desire to forge his own identity, he joined the U.S. Air Force. The military offered what he craved: authority, belonging, and routine. He excelled. He followed orders, rose through the ranks, and became a technical sergeant stationed at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. During a posting abroad, he met a young Korean woman named Im Poon, who later adopted the name Sylvia after they moved to the United States. Their relationship was fast-paced. Within months, they married, a union born as much out of escape as affection. Sylvia was quiet, delicate, and intelligent. She came from a complex background, having endured both cultural rejection and economic hardship in South Korea. For her, Edward represented a chance at stability, a way out. For him, Sylvia seemed to embody the ideal of a compliant, loyal wife. But beneath that idealism, the power dynamics were already broken. Together, they had 2 children, Edward III, whom they called Kim, and their daughter, Anna. Edward took pride in the family's appearance. They lived in a tidy house in Mary Esther, a conservative suburb filled with military families. Their children were enrolled in local schools. The lawn was always trimmed. Edward wore his Air Force uniform like armor. But at home, Sylvia's unease was growing. Family friends later recounted subtle but telling details. Sylvia was often quiet at gatherings, her gaze downcast. She was polite, but guarded. She rarely spoke unless Edward allowed her to. At parent-teacher meetings, she deferred completely to him, even when it came to their children's emotional needs. Some suspected cultural differences. Others suspected something more troubling. Then there were Edward's own behaviors. While at work, he was reliable and composed. But at home, the cracks showed. He became increasingly authoritarian, imposing rules for how Sylvia should speak, what she should wear, even how she should discipline the kids. He insisted the children follow strict regimens, often reacting with harsh punishment over minor infractions. He did not tolerate disagreement. He did not apologize. As the years passed, Edward's inner world grew darker. He struggled with feelings of inadequacy. He believed others didn't respect him the way they should. He felt threatened by Sylvia's growing independence. She had started asking questions about finances, about parenting decisions, about what she wanted from her life. And to Edward, questions felt like rebellion. By early 1994, the marriage was unraveling. Sylvia had quietly spoken to a friend about seeking a divorce. She worried about custody. She feared Edward would use the courts against her. But her greatest fear wasn't legal. It was personal. She told someone privately that she was afraid he would hurt her, that he wouldn't let her leave alive, that if he ever lost control of the family, he might destroy it entirely. That wasn't paranoia. That was prophecy. It didn't happen in a moment of rage. It wasn't a spontaneous outburst, nor a split-second mistake. What Edward Zakrzewski did in May of 1994 was deliberate, planned, and methodical. It was the cold execution of a man who had decided that if he couldn't control his family, he would destroy it. In the months leading up to the murders, Edward became more withdrawn. Colleagues at Eglin Air Force Base noticed a subtle shift. He was quieter, often lost in thought. At home, the tension grew unbearable. Sylvia had finally confronted him about separating. She wanted to take the children and move out. Edward had refused outright. He believed divorce was a form of betrayal, proof that he had failed as a husband, a father, and a man. And failure to Edward was unacceptable. On May 2nd, 1994, while the house stood quiet and unsuspecting, Edward made his move. The children were at school. Sylvia was home, unaware that she was spending her final hours alive. Edward retrieved a metal pipe from the garage. It was heavy, personal, silent. When Sylvia wasn't looking, he approached from behind and struck her, again and again, until her body collapsed in the hallway. She died within minutes. There were no screams for help, no time to run. But Edward didn't stop there. He cleaned up the scene. He moved Sylvia's body into the bathroom and began scrubbing the blood from the floor. Then he waited, calmly, coldly. He waited for his 7-year-old son, Edward III, to return from school. The little boy walked into the house expecting his mother to greet him. Instead, his father struck him with the same pipe, repeatedly, until the child stopped breathing. Hours later, 5-year-old Anna came home. She was wearing a little backpack and carried a drawing she had made for her parents. She had no idea what she was walking into. Edward tried to kill her with the pipe too, but she resisted. In her final moments, she fought, crying, begging, terrified. So he smothered her to death with a plastic bag. Then, as if none of it had happened, Edward began cleaning again. He washed the floors. He wrapped the bodies in blankets. He placed them in the master bedroom and locked the door. For the next few days, he told anyone who asked that Sylvia had taken the kids to visit relatives. He went to work. He smiled at neighbors. He kept up the illusion. But lies, like bodies, begin to rot. For weeks, Edward Zakrzewski lived as if the horrors he left behind in Florida didn't exist. After committing the murders, he boarded a plane and flew to Hawaii under an assumed name. From there, he continued on to Japan, another world entirely, far from the blood-soaked rooms of his Tallahassee home. He settled into a quiet existence, staying with friends, posing as a traveler in transition. But Edward wasn't just running from the law. He was running from what he had done. Back in Florida, however, the silence he left behind was unraveling quickly. Friends and neighbors had grown suspicious. Sylvia hadn't been seen for days. Neither had the children. Edward's vague claims that they were visiting family didn't sit right. One neighbor remembered seeing him scrubbing the floor obsessively. Another noticed the house smelled odd, like bleach, strong and unmistakable. Then came the discovery. Police, acting on a missing persons report filed by Sylvia's concerned relatives, entered the Zakrzewski home. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place, but when officers forced open the master bedroom door, the nightmare came into full view. There, wrapped in bedding and towels, were the decomposing bodies of Sylvia, Edward III, and Anna. The children were still wearing their school clothes. The room was eerily clean, too clean. But the truth had stained everything. A manhunt was immediately launched. The FBI got involved, issuing a warrant and tracking Edward across international borders. Didn't take long. Just weeks after the murders, authorities located him in Osaka, Japan. He was staying in a shared apartment, using a forged identity. When officers arrived, he didn't resist. No chase, no fight. Just a man sitting quietly on the edge of a mattress, his head in his hands. During his initial interrogations, Edward remained eerily composed. He admitted to killing his wife and children, but not out of hatred, he claimed. Instead, he painted himself as a man cornered by a crumbling marriage and a broken system. In his words, he didn't want the kids to grow up without both parents. That chilling justification would follow him through every stage of his trial. His return to the U.S. marked the beginning of one of Florida's most disturbing legal sagas. At the airport, cameras captured his arrival. Shackled and gaunt, he wore a vacant expression as reporters shouted questions he refused to answer. In the background, protesters held signs bearing the names of Sylvia, Edward III, and Anna. A community was grieving and furious. No one could understand how a father, once described as mild-mannered and intelligent, could turn into something so monstrous. But as more details emerged, it became clear. Edward hadn't snapped. He had calculated, planned, and executed, then boarded a plane and tried to vanish into the wind. He may have escaped Florida, but he couldn't outrun justice. By the time Edward Zakrzewski's trial began in the fall of 1996, the courtroom in Tallahassee was already packed with a storm of emotions: anger, disbelief, and a chilling kind of curiosity. Locals wanted answers. Sylvia's family wanted justice. And Edward, clean-shaven and dressed in a plain suit, sat expressionless at the defense table, as though he were merely a spectator in someone else's tragedy. The prosecution wasted no time painting the brutal picture. They laid out in sobering detail how Edward had bludgeoned Sylvia with a metal pipe in the master bedroom. The motive? Prosecutors argued it wasn't just about a failing marriage. It was about control. Edward had been obsessed with maintaining a pristine image of the perfect father, the upstanding churchgoer, the honorable man. But his private life told a different story. He'd been battling marital problems, financial stress, and possibly a growing resentment toward Sylvia. Rather than face divorce and the possibility of losing custody or reputation, he chose annihilation. The defense, meanwhile, walked a tightrope. They never denied that Edward had committed the murders. Instead, they leaned into a narrative of psychological unraveling. They described a man pushed to the brink, tormented, emotionally suffocated, and suffering from mental instability. They argued he wasn't evil, just broken. But nothing could erase what he had done. Witness after witness took the stand. Sylvia's friends recalled her bright spirit, her loyalty, her love for her kids. Her sister sobbed through her testimony, recounting the last phone call she had with Sylvia. A call filled with anxiety about Edward's increase in detachment. A teacher remembered little Edward Jr. as quiet but kind. Anna was remembered as lively and artistic. These weren't just victims, they were people, with laughter, memories, and futures now buried with them. When Edward himself took the stand, the room fell silent. For the first time, the killer's voice echoed through the courtroom. He didn't cry, he didn't plead. He spoke in a steady, hollow tone. He admitted to the murders, but insisted he was trying to spare the children from the pain of divorce. That justification, a perverse distortion of fatherhood, only deepened the public's outrage. The jury deliberated for just 2 hours. Edward Zakrzewski was found guilty on all counts, 3 charges of first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, he didn't flinch. He stood, motionless, as the judge handed down the sentence. Death. The courtroom erupted in gasps. Sylvia's family embraced. Some cried. Others sat in silence. Justice, in some small way, had been served. But no one left that room whole. The damage had been done. And the face of the man who had done it was etched into the minds of all who were there. The trial ended, but the story was far from over. Because Edward's next chapter would unfold not in front of a jury, but inside a prison cell on Florida's death row, where he would remain for nearly 3 decades. After the courtroom lights dimmed and the headlines faded, Edward Zakrzewski was transferred to Florida State Prison in Rayford. It was there, on death row, that he would spend the next 28 years of his life in a cell, measuring just 6 by 9 feet. The same hands that once held his children now remained cuffed behind his back as he adjusted to a new reality. Isolation, regulation, and silence. His legal team began filing appeals almost immediately after sentencing. The first came in 1997, questioning whether his confession had been truly voluntary and raising concerns about his mental health at the time of the crime. But the Florida Supreme Court upheld his conviction and sentence, ruling that the evidence was overwhelming and that his confession, while horrifying, was consistent with the physical crime scene. They found no grounds for overturning the decision. Through the early 2000s, more appeals followed, each one grasping at legal technicalities, ineffective counsel, jury misconduct, mental incompetence, due process violations. But one by one, they failed. In 2010, Zakrzewski's attorneys filed a motion for post-conviction relief, arguing that he was never properly evaluated for major depressive disorder at the time of the killings. A new psychiatric report was presented, one that claimed he may have suffered from a dissociative episode, but the courts were unmoved. While the defense painted him as a man mentally crumbling under pressure, the state continued to insist that what he did showed calculation, not confusion. In 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final federal appeal without comment. By then, Zakrzewski had become a footnote in Florida's death row history. In 2023, Florida's Attorney General filed a motion to schedule Edward Zakrzewski's execution. The state had recently resumed executions at a quicker pace, and after nearly 3 decades, his case was pushed to the front of the line. One last flurry of legal efforts came and went. His attorneys tried to delay the execution, citing health concerns and long-term isolation impacts. But none of it held. The courts signed off, and so The date was set. July 31st, 2025. Edward Zakrzewski would be executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison, just a few miles from where he'd spent nearly half his life. It was a conclusion long delayed, one that brought both relief and renewed sorrow to those still carrying the weight of what happened in that Tallahassee home so many years ago. In the weeks leading up to his execution, Edward Zakrzewski's world grew smaller. Time, once a distant and abstract thing on death row, suddenly had weight. Each sunrise was a countdown. Each meal, each moment, each breath closer to the end. For nearly 3 decades, his sentence had hung above him like a distant storm. Now, it was here. On July 1st, 2025, Florida's governor signed the execution warrant.
Record for the state of Florida. Governor DeSantis has signed the 9th death warrant this year, the most for any governor since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. The latest execution set for former Eglin Air Force Base airman Edward Zakrzewski. He's convicted of killing his wife and 2 children. In 1996, Zakrzewski pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder, receiving 3 death sentences.
The motivation was that he perceived everything as so hopeless about his wife having happiness or his children having happiness that he decided to end their misery by taking their life.
The Department of Corrections quietly began making arrangements. Zakrzewski was moved to the Death Watch cell, a narrow room just 30 feet from the execution chamber. It was sterile and quiet. In that space, he was monitored 24/7. There were no more visits to the prison yard, no more books from the library, just silence, prayer, and reflection. He declined most media requests. He didn't want to talk about the murders, the trial, or what led him there. But according to prison officials, he did speak privately to a chaplain. In their final conversations, Zakrzewski expressed a quiet sort of resignation. Not remorse in the loud public sense, but something more tired, more worn down. He spoke of his children. He asked whether they were buried together. He wanted to know if they'd been remembered kindly, apart from his shadow. A few days before the execution, his final visitors came. There weren't many. Just a cousin from his side of the family, and a long-retired friend from the Air Force who hadn't seen him in 30 years. They said little. The wait in the room made conversation hard. What can be said to a man who murdered his wife and children, and then waited 28 years to die? On the morning of July 31st, 2025, Edward J. Zakrzewski II awoke at approximately 5:15 a.m. He was served his final meal: fried pork chops, potatoes, root beer, and a serving of ice cream. He received a single visitor that day. According to prison officials, he remained calm and cooperative in his final hours. At exactly 6 p.m., the execution chamber curtains were drawn. Zakrzewski lay strapped to the gurney, covered in a white sheet. When asked for any final words, he replied, "I want to thank the good people of the Sunshine State for killing me in the most cold, calculated, clean, humane, efficient way possible. I have no complaint." He also quoted a line of poetry before the lethal drugs began to flow. Zakrzewski showed no visible signs of distress. He was pronounced dead at 6:12 p.m., with around 14 witnesses present, including members of the media and prison staff. And so, the story of Edward Zakrzewski came to its final chapter, not in fire, not in vengeance, but in silence. A life extinguished, a wound that never truly healed, a reminder that even the most unthinkable crimes don't vanish. They echo, they linger, they live on in those left behind. They say time heals all wounds. But there are wounds time doesn't touch, wounds that cut too deep, that live in the walls of a once shared home, in the silence of empty bedrooms, in family albums that suddenly stop after one terrible spring. Edward Zakrzewski's story isn't just about murder. It's about the destruction of everything a person was supposed to protect. A wife who begged to keep her family together, 2 young children who never got to grow up, and a man, cold, calculating, who convinced himself that death was better than divorce. For nearly 3 decades, the state held off on carrying out his sentence, perhaps hoping time might offer something new, a revelation, a redemption. But in the end, there was only silence, a prison cell, a final meal, a body buried under a number. And still, questions linger. What makes a man destroy the very people he once cradled in his arms? Was it rage, control, fear of being abandoned? Or was it something darker? Something broken long before he ever pulled that machete? We may never fully understand what Edward Zakrzewski was thinking on that night in 1994. But we remember the names that mattered more. Sylvia, Edward Jr., Anna. Their lives were stolen but not forgotten. Their memories live in the spaces this story leaves behind, in the heartbreak, in the silence, in the refusal to look away. Because the moment we stop remembering is the moment we risk repeating. Stay safe out there. Thank you for watching this episode of True Crime Briefing. If this story got you thinking, hit that like button and subscribe for more chilling stories like this. And remember, monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they sit across from us at the dinner table. See you in the next one.